Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. I am Michelle Bird. I am Larimer County's Public Affairs Director. And for the sake of tonight, I'm going to facilitate our meeting tonight. What really that means, it's a fancy word for the person that keeps us on time, hands out the mic for Q&A, and make sure everybody has water. So that's my role here tonight. With that being said, I want you guys to know where, first of all, there is a sink in the back. If you brought a water bottle and want to fill up your water bottle, you can always use that sink in the back. We also have some reusable cups back there. Also, if you need to use the restroom, unfortunately, it's down the hall, probably kind of where you came in. So that's the way you're going to have to come in tonight. Our doors are going to lock at 8. So if something happens here after the meeting's over and you need to go out and come back in, just let me know. That way you don't get locked out with your keys or your phone in here. All right? I think we're going to have a good time tonight. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Larimer County Commissioner John Kafalis. Commissioner.
Thank you, Michelle. I'd like to welcome everyone to the first of 4 Larimer County Water Education Series programs. As Michelle indicated, my name is John Kafalis. On behalf of the Board of County Commissioners, we'd like to welcome you all and thank you very much for your interest in participating here in person. And we are broadcasting this session. It is being recorded and it'll also be available through our YouTube channel. I certainly want to acknowledge one of my colleagues, Commissioner Jody Sheddock McNally, who is here. And again, the 3 of us, this is one of the most important things that we're undertaking to try to engage the community and inform folks about these issues that are so important. So let me just say a word about the purpose of this Water Education Series program. And the first is to inform the community about water-related issues and initiatives in the region. We have a really wonderful panel. Tonight, the theme is water supply and risk. We certainly want to answer questions, provide resources, and we want to get the community even more engaged in water issues and provide opportunities to work together to take action. Thank you to the Colorado Water Center at CSU, Colorado State University. They've been really instrumental in helping us to organize the different sessions over the next 4 months, the themes, and also assembling the various panelists. So a lot of thanks to the CSU Water Center. I certainly also want to thank specific staff within our county organization. Lori Kadrich, who I don't see here at the moment. I think she's dropping kids off back and forth. But Lori has been very instrumental in helping to bring folks together and organize this. So thank you to Lori Kadrich. And then one of our presenters is Leslie Ellis, who will talk about our water master planning process. And of course, she's the director of one of our service areas, community planning, infrastructure, and resources. So with that, I'd like to introduce Karen Schlatter. How do you say it?
Schlatter.
Schlatter?
Yep.
It's important to pronounce people's names properly. Would you all agree? Okay. Karen Schlatter. Karen is the Associate Director of the Colorado Water Center at CSU. She leads the development and implementation of the center's outreach and engagement strategy and specializes in stakeholder engagement and watershed planning and management. Karen previously worked at the University of Florida Water Institute, that's interesting, to improve water management in Florida through projects related to climate change, agricultural management practices, and freshwater systems. She also worked at the Sonoran Institute for a decade, leading landscape-scale restoration of the Colorado River Delta in Mexico. So I believe I will now turn it over to Karen. Again, thank you for being attentive. Thank you for your interest. And we hope that this will help inform us all so we can work together on this critical issue.
Thank you very much. Yes, so very happy to be here with you all tonight to learn some more about water. We've got an excellent panel speaking about water supply and risk in Larimer County. I'm going to just quickly talk through our other sessions that we're going to have. So these are the dates of our upcoming sessions. We've got water conservation and sharing, September 20th. Watershed Health and In-Stream Flows on October 18th, and What's Next for Larimer County Water, November 16th. So put those dates on your calendar. The second and third ones will be in Loveland. Okay, great. All right, and with that, so each session is going to include first a Water 101 introduction. So it kind of goes over the basics of what we're going to get into for the session. Then we'll do panel presentations. We'll have question and answer period after each presentation, very brief one just to clarify. And then afterwards, we'll open it up for question and answer and panel discussion. So that's kind of what each session includes. Today we have John Tracy. I'm going to read all of their bios now. So Dr. John Tracy serves as the director of the Colorado Water Center at Colorado State University. He has led program initiatives on understanding and developing sustainable water resource management practices in a number of basins across the western United States, including the Western High Plains, Northern Plains, Great Basin, and Pacific Northwest hydroclimatological regions. As director of the Colorado Water Center, he works with private, state, regional, and federal entities in the development of programs that more effectively support achieving their water and environmental resource management objectives. The next speaker will be Leslie Ellis. She currently serves as Larimer County's Community Planning, Infrastructure, and Resources Director and is leading the Water Master Plan project. She has 3 decades of experience working for and consulting with over 40 communities around the U.S. on long-range plans and policies, codes, infrastructure projects, and open lands programs. She received a Master of Urban Planning and a Master of Landscape Architecture from the University of Washington in Seattle and a Bachelor of Environmental Design from the University of Colorado in Boulder. Then we'll hear from Lindsay Rogers. She is a water policy analyst at Western Resource Advocates, where she advances water conservation at the municipal level to bolster water security and protect Western rivers. She facilitates local and state policy development and advises on projects to implement water-saving strategies, including gray water ordinances, water-wise landscaping programs, and integrated water and land use planning in the West. Then we'll hear from Brad Udall. He is a senior water and climate research scientist and scholar at Colorado State University's Colorado Water Center. His expertise includes hydrology and related policy issues of the American West with a focus on the Colorado River. Brad was a co-author of the 2009 and 2018 National Climate Assessments and a contributing author to the 2014 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Fifth Assessment. He has testified in both the U.S. Senate and U.S. House of Representatives on the impacts of climate change on water resources and provided input to multiple National Academy of Science panels. Brad was formerly the director of the Getches Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and Environment at the University of Colorado Law School and director of the University of Colorado NOAA Western Water Assessment. He has an engineering degree from Stanford and an MBA from Colorado State University. And last but not least, we will hear from Esther Vincent. She completed her master's degree in civil engineering in 1999 from the Grenoble Institute of Technology in France. She is a registered professional engineer in Colorado and has been with Northern Water since 1999. Vincent has experience with water quality, watershed management, water supply planning, environmental permitting and regulations, and water conservation. Recently, she has been leading Northern Water's post-fire watershed restoration efforts in the wake of the 2020 East Troublesome Fire. She oversees Northern Water's water quality, water efficiency, and flow monitoring programs, environmental planning and compliance, and environmental data management systems. She has served on the boards of the Grand County Water Information Network, the Big Thompson Watershed Forum, and the Colorado Water-Wise Council, and is an alumna of the Water Education Colorado Water Leaders Program. She was born and grew up in Paris, France, and went to college in the French Alps, where she became an avid skier. She enjoys being outdoors with her family and likes to spend her free time playing in Colorado's beautiful backcountry. So with that, I'm going to open up our first presenter's presentation, which will be John Tracy. and he's going to give us a little bit of background for our session, a little bit of Water 101. So take it away, John.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, when I get asked to do talks about water, we want you to give an introduction to water. It's sort of like H2O. I don't know. It's an interesting topic, and you can get how should I say? It's very difficult to cover in just an overview. So this is my shot at it. So the first thing I want to cover is just remembering how water moves through the environment, because as much as we've all learned, it's something sometimes it looks like we forget when we're involved in setting policy, planning, or management. And then kind of go into basically, where does Colorado's water come from? How does Colorado manage its water? And finally, what is Colorado's water used for? Because in a lot of discussions I've seen, it sort of gets addressed, but not to the level of detail that I think everybody needs to really look at and understand where our water is going within the state and also in leaving the state. So first, I'm going to start with the classic. Water moves in a cycle and is never created or destroyed. I don't know if most of you know this, but the water molecule is the most conservative molecule on the planet. There is no molecule like water where it is incredible amounts of energy to break the hydrogens from the oxygen, and it is incredible effort to make oxygen and hydrogen combine into water at the scale. So when you look at water and you start saying, how much water is on the earth? Well, it's how much water has ever been on the earth and will ever be on the earth. And in regards to this, we think of oxygen as something that, well, it's always here. There's been a measurable decline in the amount of O2 in the atmosphere in our lifetime. There has been no measurable decline in the amount of water. That just gives you a perspective of how conservative water is. And so if water is this conservative, it never vanishes. It's not like hydrocarbons. It's not like any other material we see as driving an economic engine. It is not truly consumable. We talk about consumption, but really we're just transforming water from a solid phase to a liquid phase to a vapor phase, and then the cycle continues. When we do this, we have to understand, we tend to look at our water problems as local, and so we tend to look at our water as kind of a local resource, and we extract it and use it. Oh, it's gone. It's not there. It's still in the cycle. But since it's in a cycle, anything we do has an impact through the entire cycle, at the local scale, at the regional scale, at the national scale, at the global scale. So this is one of these things we need to understand about water. Incredibly conservative substance. It never gets created or goes away. It just changes form, and anything we do to it permutates throughout the cycle as we continue. In terms of how much water is there, well, this is always fun. I'm sure you've all heard this one. 97.5% of the water on the earth is saline water in the ocean. Most of that is ocean, little bit of saline groundwater. So you're left with 2.5% of the Earth's resources in freshwater. And if you look at that, about 2/3 of that, a little over 2/3, is in glaciers, which is very difficult to get your hands on. I was just in Alaska, and you can look at the glaciers and you sort of say, you're not using that as a water resource. It's naturally going to melt, come down the streams, you can use it that way, but actually tapping into it the way we tap into streams, lakes, and groundwater is impractical, and we're never going to do this. But something else to think about is that when we look at how long does water reside in each of these forms, ice caps and glaciers, centuries to millennia. It's there for a long time. Groundwater, years to millennia. When we look at the South Platte groundwater alluvium, that may be in there for years. The Ogallala, it's been in there for millennia. And when we look at the atmosphere, it's in there from days to weeks. We look at streams and lakes, it's hours to weeks to months. So our freshwater resources are in a form and much more accessible. They cycle, they move through the cycle much more quickly there. And to also give you a perspective, if we just simply looked at streams, lakes, and groundwater and said how much water is on this earth and then compared it to how much water we use annually, we have 26 billion years worth of supply on the earth just from those sources. So when you start looking at water as a global issue, you kind of run into a problem, because when you realize that's over 6 times as long as we think the earth has been around. And so this is something where locally and regionally we may have groundwater issues. When we look at it as kind of a global phenomena, we're not even close to using as much water that would even start impacting how much fresh water exists on the earth right now. Okay, Colorado's water resources. And I love this diagram because the fatter the diagram, the fatter the, the river section, with the dark blue being a flood year and the light blue being a drought year, the more water. And if you look at this, you say, oh my goodness, look at all those really fat river lines on the western Colorado, and look at all those thin lines on eastern Colorado. And you realize most of Colorado's water is in the western slope west of the Continental Divide. And we all know that most of our population and actually our agricultural production is on the eastern side. So this is where Colorado really has an imbalance of its water supply. Its water supply is really dominated by water coming down in snowfall and then melting off and going into the Yampa White River, the Colorado River, the Gunnison River, and then the Southwest rivers. Whereas on the east side, we do have some water in the South Platte in Arkansas, North Platte and Rio Grande, but it's not nearly the supply that exists on the west slope. So what did Colorado do about this? Well, Colorado has a total of 44 structures that divert water from one watershed to another. Now, some divert water from one watershed in the west to another. The vast majority of these take water west of the Continental Divide and move it east of the Continental Divide. The largest single diversion is a power canal that really just moves water from the Gunnison to the Colorado and generates power. But when we look at the diversion that moves water from west to east, the largest one is the Adams Tunnel, which diverts over 200,000 acre feet per year from the Colorado to the South Platte River watershed. And so this is how Colorado deals with this water imbalance. We basically went high up in the mountains, built diversion structures, and changed the hydrology of Colorado to move water that naturally would have flown down the western watersheds. Now it flows down the eastern watersheds. The other water resource in Colorado that is used, that is important, is groundwater. And really, Colorado defines groundwater in two general characteristics. One is what we call alluvial groundwater. This is groundwater that exists very close to rivers and in many respects is like the river. It's like taking this groundwater is like taking water out of the river. There's the South Platte alluvium, there's the Arkansas alluvium, and many others across the state. So while this is considered groundwater, it is also considered, when we look at how we manage it, as part of the river. Then we have the bedrock aquifers, which tend to be much more disconnected from the surface water supplies, and those are treated in a bit different of a fashion. They also tend to not recharge as quickly. That is, they tend not to get as much water coming in as maybe we're taking out. And so when we look at groundwater use in Colorado, about 85% of the groundwater use is used for irrigated agriculture. 18% of the groundwater's population relies on 18% of Colorado's population relies on groundwater for their home, which sounds like a lot. Maybe some of you aren't familiar with this. The vast majority of Western U.S., the percentages that rely on groundwater are much, much higher for municipal water sources and population. As an example, 97% of Idaho's population relies on groundwater. And so Colorado, in terms of its municipal water supply, very little relies on groundwater compared to most of the other Western states. Now, the real problem with this is that when we look at the groundwater use, 60% of the groundwater use is from non-renewable resources. That means it's coming from these bedrock aquifers that are not getting enough recharge to recharge what is being used. A large portion of this is the Ogallala Aquifer that many of you have probably heard about, but it's one of these sources where eventually this using more than naturally recharges the aquifer will slowly lead to a decline and slowly lead to a reduction in use. That is, if you're looking at this from a sustainable use point of view, it'll take care of itself. But if you're someone who relies on the water for irrigated agriculture, it's a bit of a problem. Water management in Colorado. This is another one where I talked about the imbalance in water supply, with a large portion of the water supply coming from the west and a large amount of the demand being in the east. And we sort of address this through physical change in moving water from the west to the east. There's another issue where the way the water comes down with the snow melt, it's always been the snow starts melting May, June, maybe peaks in July, and then really starts tapering off in August and September. Well, a lot of agriculture and a lot of people in cities with lawns like to have water in August and September and even into October now. And so there's another way we modify the hydrology of the region, and that's through the construction of water infrastructure that basically slows down the movement of water as it moves down the channel. And if we start looking at this, basically you have this, most of the water in Colorado comes from snowpack. Snowpack starts melting and flow increases in the early summer. Then there are many, many reservoirs constructed around Colorado. Colorado itself doesn't have extremely large reservoirs, but it has a large number of smaller reservoirs that capture this water before it makes it down to where we would use it. And you can see examples of these when you go up in the hills. I mean, Dillon Reservoir obviously is a reservoir. Many, many reservoirs along up in the high country. This catches the water so it can be released later in the summer, so it sort of flattens out when the flow comes down. And then when it's released from the reservoir through the dam, basically we have ditches, pipelines, canal systems that divert the water from the river to the water use. In addition to that, we have groundwater pumpage that goes to the water use. Now, not all of this water is used. It flows through these ditches. Some of it seeps back to groundwater. Some of it just isn't used, and it wraps around and returns to the stream. And so any water that isn't used, the canals allow water that is not needed to be returned to the river. And so one of the interesting things, and I'll get to this at the end when we talk about water use, there's a term we're using now which is extracted water. That is the water that's taken out of the groundwater, the stream, the reservoir, and consumed water. And that's water that is actually evaporated and from a local perspective goes up in the air and then blows off to Kansas or Nebraska or wherever and is not available for use. And those are very different numbers because up until recently, the only use reported was what was taken out of a stream or groundwater or reservoir. Now there's much more information on what is actually consumed, and that becomes very useful to aid in water management. So, what is water management in Colorado? Well, going through this quickly, Colorado follows what most Western states follow, called the Prior Appropriations Doctrine. What this means, and it's really important to understand this, because many times conversations get going where water rights get discussed as a property right. It is not a property right. If you have a property right, you own whatever that property is. All water in Colorado is owned by the state of Colorado, which means it's owned by the citizens of Colorado, which means the legislature has every right to change the rules. A lot of people don't understand this because it gets into some interesting discussions when people start conflating property rights with what is essentially, and this is a term I never get right, but is a usufructuary right. And basically what that means is having a right to use somebody else's property. That's what a water right is. And there are elements of defining a water right. And when you go out and want a water right, you're basically asking the state of Colorado, can I use your water? And they're going to ask you 5 questions. And they're going to say, what's the beneficial use of water? And the state defines that. And it's a very clear list of irrigated agriculture, municipal. Some states have in-stream flow as a beneficial use, others don't. And so the state defines what it considers a beneficial use of water, which is a requirement if you apply for a water right. Second, where do you want to divert this from? Is it a groundwater well? Is it a stream? Third, what area are you going to use it on? You can't just say, I'm going to take it out of the stream and figure it out later. You have to actually define what area of the stream. What rate are you going to take it out? That is, you can't go above a certain rate. And finally, what's the maximum? And so in Colorado, what makes it unique is that the decisions, once all this information is put in, you apply, the decision on granting a water right is done through the water courts. A lot of other states, it's done through what's called the state engineer's office. In Colorado, it's a legal proceeding. Most other states, it's an administrative proceeding. And the other part, and Brad will probably get into this in the Colorado River has a lot of water compacts. And so I have a list here. You can see it on the list. Many of these you've probably heard about. The ones that are probably most problematic right now are the Colorado River Compact, the South Platte Compact, the Rio Grande Compact, and the Republican Compact. And actually, there's a lot of compacts that have a lot of problems right now you want to read about. And it is an interesting issue that Colorado's going to have to face to. They have a lot of compacts that are having a lot of issues meeting Colorado's obligations under the compacts. It's something that Colorado's going to have to deal with. And finally, the last part, Colorado's water uses. Where do we use the water? Colorado is not unusual for most Western states. The vast majority of water is used in irrigated agriculture. What makes Colorado a little unique is that if you start looking at the total water extracted, it's 11 million acre feet. I can tell you, Colorado does not have 11 million acre feet of water. What happens here is the total water consumed is only 3.7 million acre feet. So there's a lot of situations where the water gets diverted, it's counted as extracted, it comes around, goes back in, same water gets diverted, gets counted again, same thing, same thing, same thing. But if we look at it and say, how much water actually gets consumed to the point that is being used by households, industry, agriculture, it's about 3.7 million acre feet. And this is from a 2015 USGS water use survey. It's in terms of use, municipal use in terms of consumption is about 25% of the total use. Ag is still the dominant use here within the state. And the vast majority of that is on the eastern plains and some on the western slopes. So with that, these are just the basics of Colorado water, many details of how the entire system works. And these will be discussed by many of the other people in the session here. But this is kind of the basic overview of water in Colorado. And like I said, a whole lot more details to get into. And I guess we're going to have the questions at the end.
Well, so what we're going to do, this is for each speaker. If you guys have clarifying questions about the presentation specifically, we're going to have a very few short minutes after each speaker to ask clarifying questions. If you have broader questions, we're going to have panel time at the end for you guys to kind of ask your broader questions. Is that clear to everybody the way I explained it? So we have maybe 4 minutes or so for any questions for Dr. Tracy about his presentation specifically. And just so you all know, we are broadcasting live. So if you have a question, I'm going to ask you to use the mic so that if there's folks listening online, they can hear what your question is. Do you guys have any questions right now for Dr. Tracy? Perfectly clear. Clear as water. There you go. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I'm going to ask a question, which
Please
is,
do.
what is an acre foot of water, John?
It is completely self-explanatory. It is a foot of water on top of an acre. And if you want to think of what an acre is, it's about the size of a football field. So if you look at, some like the Spring Creek flood, where we flooded, many parts of Fort Collins. If you think about a high school football field with a foot of water on it and saw what that looked like, which there were pictures, that's an acre foot of water. And so that gives you a perspective on, what an acre foot is. Other than that, I could convert it to gallons, but the second you go into millions of gallons or other things, it's hard to imagine. So I think the easiest one is probably the acre foot. And until we started talking thousands of acre feet, where I was trying to explain 1,000 feet of water on top of an acre, and that's a little hard to imagine too.
Yeah. Oh, looks like we have a question over here.
You mentioned that the water courts determine the water, have it? So if somebody wants to sell water like a farmer, does the water court have to then approve that? Or is that just a money transaction?
That gets into an interesting question because it can go several ways. Most times, if it's simply a land, so if somebody owns a piece of land, they have agriculture, they sell it with the water right, that's not going to end up in the water court. It could, but it's probably not. If somebody has water designed for a beneficial use, say irrigated agriculture, and they want to sever that from the land that's associated with their water right and even move it to use on another acre foot, that will probably end up with another water right holder that feels they're effective that would push it to water court. If it changes beneficial use, I'll almost guarantee it ends up in water courts. I can't think of a case where it would not. And so when you're talking about an irrigated agricultural interest selling a water right to a municipality, that changes the beneficial use. And that most likely somebody is going to come in and say, wait a minute, this is going to affect me. And I have a right to continue mine. It'll affect my access to my water. Then they'll push it to water court and I'll end up in water court. In most other states, that process would be administrative with the state engineer's office. In Colorado, it's water courts.
thought I saw one more hand, and that's probably all we have time for before our next presenter. Go ahead.
This is simple. But are these slides available to us?
Yes, that's a very good question. So, what we will do, if you look at your agenda, let me hold one up. And if you didn't get an agenda, let me know. I'll get you one. There is a link on the agenda towards the bottom that will have, it's our webpage that we'll put these video up and the slides and stuff.
Thank you, John. And now we'll have Leslie Ellis give us an overview of water planning in Larimer County.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Leslie Ellis, and I'm glad you asked the question about slides because I'm going to fly through some of this, and I've got a lot of numbers and facts and figures, so that way you can find them later. So I am, as Commissioner Kafalis or somebody introduced me earlier, a service area director here at the county, and so I have the great honor of working with multiple departments on a water plan, and I'd also like to acknowledge a few people who are here, Dalen Figgs from our Natural Resources Department, and Mark Peterson from Engineering, and Lori Kadrich, who wasn't here earlier when Commissioner Kafalis introduced her, have all been part of this effort so far, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it here, but it is very much a multi-departmental project. We're also working with the Emergency Operations Center staff and others to identify various risks and vulnerabilities. So what I want to do today is just give you a brief overview of what we've been working on and where we're headed, and then hopefully if this is a topic of interest to you, please let us know, and we'll keep in touch with you and tell you when there are opportunities to be part of our water planning effort. So here at Larimer County, we have a few different plans and policies that lay the groundwork for our interests in water planning. And our county commissioners are very supportive, as you can see, in working on efforts like this, but also in supporting projects and funding to do work around water in Larimer County. We also have in our strategic plan, the 2019 through 2023 strategic plan, several objectives that address improving long-term planning for water supply and infrastructure and incorporated in unincorporated areas, and promoting water sharing strategies to preserve agriculture and sustain water supplies, and then a whole suite of water conservation and water quality policies and goals in our comprehensive plan from 2029. And so we use those as a backdrop when we start to look at issues around water and water planning. What's kind of unique about Larimer County versus, say, many of the cities in the region, we don't provide water. We don't build infrastructure for water, but I'll tell you a little bit more about the kind of the water system in Larimer County in general. So we wanted to make sure that we were addressing aspects of water that are in our lane to work on, and that where we think we can add value or make a difference, but not interfere with the work that the water providers and other systems are doing in Larimer County. So we set out to do some foundational work in 2021 through 2022 to basically get a better sense of what is going on in Larimer County in terms of some of our existing conditions and our systems. And so we had work to look at water conditions through the lens of water supplies, uses and demands, and vulnerabilities. And we worked with a team of consultants, Brendel Group and Logan Simpson, and I'm actually using some of their slides here today. But they did a lot of the work, and we had funding from Sonoran Institute and Department of Local Affairs to put together some initial information about what's going on in Larimer County, and then reach out to the community and get a little bit more input from those who are interested to say, what are some of the goals, what are the issues, what are some of the goals that we should be working on. And then this was really set up to be the foundation to then do more and move forward with a broader planning effort, which is what we're starting this year. And so there is an existing conditions report. It's available on our project webpage, and that's noted up here. So if you're interested, you can go and see the whole report and download it. I'll go through some of the high-level input that's in there, but this summarizes where we are with a number of factors related to water and water systems in the county. We had some limited, we didn't have a lot of time or a ton of funding, so we really relied heavily on data that was available. We didn't do original research, so we used publicly available plans and provider plans and data from the state of Colorado water databases and so on. And then we got input from a number of the water providers and other interested parties in the state to develop that water plan. So I'll just go through some of the aspects of it and what we know about Larimer County. But like many of the Front Range communities and that you saw on Dr. Tracy's map, we're rapidly growing. We're on the Front Range. We're expected to grow to 536,000 people approximately by 2040. What's maybe unique about Larimer County versus some of the other counties along the Front Range is that most of that growth will go in cities and municipalities and in what we call growth management areas in the county. And again, we don't provide water, but there are a number of incorporated areas that have water systems, and then a number of districts that I'll talk about shortly. And you can see on the map here, we're very much a rural county, largely in public lands and parks and so on. And then along the Front Range, where most of our municipalities are, that's where the growth management areas are, with the exception of Estes and some of the smaller communities up near Red Feather. And here you can see the map of what we call our growth management areas and the municipalities that largely have the water systems and that are separated in some cases by open spaces and buffers, but otherwise are centered along that Front Range corridor. And so in terms of water supplies in the county, we are just to get into some of the findings from the state Colorado water databases and provider plans, about half of the water in the county originates from the Colorado River. And so that, of course, raises some questions about reliability and water supply. We've seen a lot of the diversions increasing in the county and expect to see that continue, and that puts some pressure on available water and environmental flows. We are still seeing a decline in agricultural land, which underscores some of the needs around water sharing arrangements and some of the pilot projects that we've seen in the county. Water service is very distributed, so you can see the statistics here that we have about 124 water providers and almost 11,000 homes that are reliant on wells. A good part of the county is self-supplied water or small districts, and so that raises some questions about, what does that mean during times of drought or times of emergency? And then depending on how developed communities are, water providers are estimating, quite a bit of growth in water demands in the future. And so some of them, a smaller amount, closer to 25%, some of them might see, almost doubling their supplies. One of the aspects of that conditions report is it does go through a summary of each of the water providers and a lot of the factors such as their land use authorities or their service population, how much they expect to serve their water supplies and their yields, and then some of the vulnerabilities as well. And then the report also starts to go into the different system risks and then later the county-wide risks. In terms of some of the system risks, we're finding that there's a need for more infrastructure. Most of the planned projects in Larimer County are around improved raw water storage. Many of the municipal providers in the county, so City of Fort Collins and so on, have more senior and diversified portfolios, and a lot of the districts tend to be working to try to diversify their portfolios. We're also seeing that there's a lot of, as Dr. Tracy talked about, a lot of pretty complicated contractual agreements. There's definitely a need for more infrastructure investment and consistent data. From a countywide standpoint, you can see some of the factors here. I see Michelle standing up, so I'm going to whip through my last two slides. Okay, so our study certainly doesn't capture all the vulnerabilities and risks, but you can see some of them here around reduced water availability from droughts, fires, climate change, what we're really all experiencing in the West, concern about Colorado River water being curtailed under a compact call. There's relatively low reuse potential without gray water programs. And then there are already service delivery limitations that we're seeing where there's some service districts that are imposing moratoria and questions about future service around water. This slide just highlights a few of those other factors too that I think we've touched on before, but I'll just highlight a few here that I haven't said already. Housing affordability, I think we find that that has a nexus with water supply requirements, certainly agriculture, watersheds and rivers and their health, and then water supplies. So as far as where we're headed next, so this year, starting right about now and then through the end of next year, we have engaged another team of consultants to work with our team in the county and the community to work on a water master plan. And that will help us develop a more detailed roadmap of actions and areas that we should focus around achieving different goals. This will go through the end of next year, possibly even into early 2025. And we want to make sure that we do something of value. We want to stay in our lane of not being a water provider again, but at the regional scale, we think there are aspects that we could focus on as a county to address things like environmental flows and water sharing, water conservation, educating folks about water, leading by examples on various fronts. We are aware of and don't want to step on the toes of some of the other groups that are doing work, but potentially add to or leverage some of the work that other organizations in the community are doing. And then as we move forward, we will be taking a bit more of a watershed approach and looking at risks and reliability. And this is just a hypothetical example up on the screen, but that'll be a core part of the plan and the work that we do. And so we've got this, 8-step schedule lined out for the next year or so. And if you're interested in this, please go to that web page address that I showed earlier, and you can find more information on that. And if this is something that interests you, we do hope that you'll contact us and let us know that you'd like to get more information and be informed about the project and may have information to add to it and participate with us. So thank you very much.
All right, it looks like we have a question right in front. Let me get the mic on. There you go.
I'm just wondering who decides if there's enough water to approve a new housing development?
So I'll talk about it from the county's perspective because every community has their own process and their own way of looking at it. So what Fort Collins does and Loveland does are different. In the county, we require somebody who's coming to the county to do a subdivision or have basically to do a subdivision to come to us with a letter from the state water resource department saying that they have water, or come to us from a water district saying that they have a supply of water, and then they're eligible to move forward in their process. The problem that we're starting to see is that there are these districts now that have moratoria where they're actually saying that they don't have water after all. And so we do have some property owners who've bought lots who are finding that that's a bit of a challenge. But in general, the county requires some evidence that there's water before we issue a permit for a subdivision, or we give approval for a subdivision and then give permits for building permits.
I know you got a question earlier, so I'm going to go to someone else that is. Yeah, let's go right back that way. Thank you.
You said that one of the findings was that there wasn't enough raw water storage. Can you give an example of what raw water storage is?
Irrigation, lakes and reservoirs, basically, or reservoirs for water supply for drinking water and so forth. Yeah.
Will the county be in favor of additional storage for small entities? Additional reservoir storage?
So the way the county, so the county doesn't necessarily propose storage facilities. Yes, right, exactly. We have a process to review those. So typically a water district or an entity will approach us with a proposal to build a facility or expand a facility, and then they go through what we call our 1041 review process, and then they're issued a permit if approved through the 1041 permit process. Does that answer?
Here, hold on. Use the mic so that people.
Yeah.
Do you foresee county government being supportive of additional small reservoir storage projects within our county?
Yeah, so if a project is proposed and it meets the criteria of the permitting requirement and it, is able to demonstrate that it minimizes the environmental impacts and it has the benefits and it's addressed all the criteria, then we've had 1041 permits that are approved. It's a decision ultimately of the county commissioners. It goes through our planning commission and then our county commissioners, and they review it on the basis of all those criteria.
I think we probably have time for one more question, but we can ask more questions at the end. So if you have questions that we didn't get to, please hold on to them. Go ahead.
Approximately 50% of the water that's treated for municipal use gets used for outdoor irrigation. And during the peak summer months, that rises to about 70 or 80%. So that's a tremendous investment by all the water providers. Are there things that the county can do from a land use management and regulatory perspective that might be able to limit the outdoor water use and perhaps stretch it so that we don't have quite such an increase in water demand as our population grows?
I think that might be a rhetorical question, John, right? Because you know the answer probably, but as a member of our planning commission. But yes, there are, the county can put landscape standards in place as one possible way forward. Again, what we do applies to the unincorporated area of the county. So doing something on a more shared or joint basis with the other districts and municipalities probably would have, better bang for the buck. But yeah, there certainly are things we can do.
Thank you, Leslie. And as we get ready for our next presenter, Commissioner Kristen Stevens has joined us. So I just wanted to say hi, Kristen. Thanks for being here. Our next, as Karen gets the next presentation going, I want to reintroduce Lindsay Rogers from the Western Resource Associates.
Yes.
Advocates.
And she will actually be addressing, I think, many of the questions that were just asked. And I also wanted to point out there's television screens around. I see many people trying to look at what's up here, and it's very small. There's also screens around the room.
Yes, thank you to John for setting up my presentation comments perfectly. Hey everyone, thanks so much for being here, and thanks to the Water Center and Larimer County for organizing this series. It's great to be here with you all tonight. I am here to talk about our most effective strategies that we have available to us in our Colorado communities for integrating water efficiency into our land use planning practices and ensuring that in the face of drought and climate change and this very fast population growth that some of our counties are experiencing, we can still have resilient supplies and prosperous communities. For those not familiar with us, WRA is an environmental organization. We're based in Boulder, and we have a mission to protect the West land, air, water, and climate. We work throughout the 7 mountain states listed here. And we do that by advancing or identifying policy opportunities and then working across a variety of different levels, federal, state, municipalities, counties, water providers to help implement, support those strategies. So my comments today, I'm going to provide just a brief introduction to this topic, sort of the why behind municipal water efficiency and integrated planning, some of the trends we're seeing. Then I'll talk about the overview of strategies available to us throughout the development process to build more water efficiently. And finally, I'll end with some examples and case studies, mostly from up here in northern Colorado. So why does municipal water use matter. Dr. Tracy mentioned that municipal water use is a small piece of the pie. We need to compare our numbers. I believe these are from the Colorado Water Plan, and maybe the discrepancy is in the industrial use here. But either way, small component of overall water use compared to agriculture in Colorado. But, there's a lot of folks that are really working in this space, and that's because we're facing some very unique challenges in the municipal sector. So by 2050, the Colorado Water Plan estimates a 360,000 acre feet per year projected municipal industrial supply and demand gap. It's very large. 1 acre foot's about the water that 3 Colorado households use currently in a year. So that's about 1 million Colorado household current use. And mostly that's because, we're growing. So by 2050, we're anticipated to grow by about 1.5 million. That growth is being coupled with climate change, these prolonged drought conditions that Brad's going to talk much more to us about. That increased demand on limited supplies means the cost of water is escalating for our cities, right? And Esther can correct this stat if you've got some more recent data. But, we use the Colorado Big Thompson project managed by Northern Water as a good proxy for the cost of water in northern Colorado. And right now it's up around $100,000 per 1 acre foot. So it's getting quite expensive to secure new water. And that increased demand can also mean that we're impacting other water users, right? We're seeing decreases in irrigated agriculture, and that's pretty consistent throughout the state. We're seeing increased demand on our rivers and streams. We're having quite a good water year right now. I think we all recognize that, but we also know it's not nearly enough to negate any of these long-term trends in this water supply and demand equation. So that's why in recent years, we're starting to see much more of this shift from what was once a supply side water management strategy to more emphasis, resources, investment in demand side water management. And when we talk about demand side water management, these are just some terms that come up. So conservation is sort of behavior change, right? When we encourage all of our residents, our community members to reduce their use. Water efficiency is when we implement policy, we encourage the use of technology, building or site design that uses less water. So a lot of that happens in new development. And then water reuse is when we convert gray and black water to replace or augment our supplies. It's really critical in Colorado. And when we shift to these demand-side solutions at scale, what we can actually see is a start to decouple population growth from demand. So up here in Colorado, in Fort Collins, the city grew 6% from 2000 to 2015, but saw their total water use reduced by 14%. So, Colorado Springs here potentially, the most impressive. Since the mid-'80s, they've grown 92%, but the city is using about the same amount of water today as it was 40 years ago. So that means that not only can we see major reductions in the water we use per person, but even in the face of growth, some communities can start to reduce their overall demand. Outdoor water use, a big theme, especially right now in the municipal conservation sector. And, as John noted, that's because nearly 50% of municipal water supplies in Colorado are used outdoors. Most of that water is going to irrigate high water use, cool season turf grass. So things like Kentucky bluegrass, very, very common, across Colorado communities for many decades. The water we apply outdoors is really critical because it's almost entirely consumptive. So, John talked about consumptive use. That water is either getting used by the plant or it's evaporating. It's hardly any of that is being used down the line, which is, different from our indoor water use, which is mostly can be reused. A term that we're seeing a lot more in recent years is non-functional turf grass. So, to put it as simply as possible, non-functional turf is the type of lawn where the only person mowing or maintaining it, the only person using it is the person mowing it or maintaining it, I should say. Yeah. So it's not recreational, right? Your kids aren't playing on it. You're not using it for soccer practice. These are things like median strips and, commercial industrial parks, sloped areas, maybe front yards that you're not using in your household. So what we know is that when we can replace or limit non-functional turf grass in our communities, that really is one of the most impactful, conservation tools we have at our disposal. Okay, so let's get into the meat of it. Why do we care about integrated water and land use planning? How does it help us achieve those demand reduction, demand management goals? Well, historically, these fields were very siloed. So we had our land use planners and our community development directors, those folks, determine how, where, when the community was going to grow, and then the water planners, the water resource managers would come in and figure out how to identify new supply to support that growth. And then, folks started to realize there was a lot of inefficiency, a lot of missed opportunities in that process, and these fields have now started to be more integrated. When we integrate these two sectors, we can significantly reduce the water demand of our new development and our redevelopment and help to bolster our water security. It also empowers communities to improve, their water efficiency, their integrated planning through their own context, like we learned about with Larimer County. This is directing communities to come up with their own comprehensive plans, their own codes, things that will work well for them. It might not be exactly the same even in a neighboring community. And as we talked about, this helps us to better align our supply demand, increase our resiliency to drought and climate change. A lot of the initiative behind this movement was from a 2015 Colorado Water Plan goal, which was that by 2025, they wanted to see 75% of Coloradans living in communities that had integrated their water and land use planning. And our best estimates is that we're somewhere in the 60 to 80% range, so making some real significant progress in all of our communities towards that goal. So there's lots and lots of specific tools available to communities to integrate their water and land use planning, and they happen at all different intervention points along the development process. So that first is planning and policy making. We heard a little bit about comprehensive planning, water master planning. This is how we set our goals, our priorities, how we're going to fund things, the policy we're going to develop in, 5, 10, 20 years from now. Then we get into pre-development phase. This is where we can link new development to water supply planning. We talked a little bit about adequate water supply standards. This is in the pre-development phase. Next is the development review process. So this can be used to determine what conservation efficiency requirements or incentives are applied to new developments, new subdivisions. Building and construction, that's where we implement water efficiency tools, best practices in our building, plumbing, landscaping codes. And then finally, post-occupancy. This is what, we think of more of our traditional city conservation programs that are intended to support all residents, not just new development. So now I'm going to walk through just a few examples from all of those development stages, and I think we'd be remiss not to talk about comprehensive planning because that's where it all starts. That's where the vision for the community is laid out, and in 2020 there was legislation passed in Colorado that really tries to ensure that water planning and water efficiency is included in the comprehensive planning process. And in that same year, WRA got to support the town of Severance with a comp plan update. And they really, took a hard look at their old plan and decided they were going to do a much more concrete overview of water efficiency, create dedicated chapters, and not only that, but incorporate water efficiency throughout the plan. So this is one of the lines from that plan that they ended up with that I think was particularly effective. Any proposal for changing land uses in or around Severance will be evaluated based on a number of other things and water resource availability and commitment to water efficient development practices. And then just in the last couple of years, they've started to work the plan, right? So they changed their multi-family zoning codes, allowed for denser development. They're working now on single-family residential, and they've developed a plan that was implementable. The next strategy here is conservation-oriented tap fees. So tap fees are an opportunity to incentivize conservation by trying to more closely tie tap fee costs for new development to actual water use. So traditionally, our tap fees have been based on meter size. So you're going to pay roughly the same thing no matter the size of your house, the size of your lot. But more and more, we're seeing this shift towards conservation-oriented strategies that base these fees on lot size, landscapable area, maybe even landscape material, number of bedrooms and bathrooms, basically to get a sense of what the actual water use of that lot will be. And we put out a guide in 2018, and one of the examples, case studies in there is from Little Thompson Water District, which serves about 8,000 folks here in northern Colorado. And they noticed that their new residential development was naturally, trending towards smaller lot sizes. So they created this new urban tap fee dedication. And what they did was they significantly reduced the cost of the water dedication portion of that fee. But the hook is that they now have a surcharge. So the urban tap customers are on the hook to stay within their 114,000 gallon annual water budget, and if they exceed that, then they'll pay this surcharge. The next is zoning codes. So zoning codes regulate what can and can't be built in a certain area or zone in your community. So, for example, I live down in Edgewater near Denver, and in my neighborhood, it's mostly single-family residential for the entire town. Actually, it's a small town, which is fairly common, throughout our communities. But what we know, and I'd say this is maybe a lesser utilized strategy at this point, but we know that, one of our strongest water efficiency tools is to build denser, more infill development that can significantly reduce demand and infrastructure cost. So these are just some stats from a Keystone Policy Center report in 2018 that looked at some sample data from Aurora and Denver. And they found that compared to a single-family home, ADUs use 22% less water. Small family unit, duplex style, uses 63% less. And then that large multifamily apartment building units use 86% less water. So obviously, when we talk about denser development, lots of other considerations: affordability, transit, open space. It's a tough issue, but it is a really significant opportunity that we have in the water conservation space. Moving into landscape regulations. So landscape breaks can help us to significantly limit the water demand of new landscaping, and that's really important because it's much more cost effective, much more efficient to install a water-wise landscape with native plants, grasses, than it is to retrofit, right, and replace cool season turf grass that's already been installed. And this has been in the news a little bit this year because Castle Rock and Aurora have passed new rules limiting cool season turf grass. So Castle Rock has now said, we're not going to have new lawns in commercial development. We're going to limit lawns to 500 square feet in backyards. And then we're also going to have all these other best practices around soil amendments and mulch and irrigation efficiency, these things that we know can also significantly reduce the water demand of our landscapes. And there's more and more communities that we're seeing who are sort of moving in that direction. Okay, final strategy. Has anyone in here participated in a turf replacement incentive program through your city, maybe through Resource Central? Seeing one hand. Okay, cool. So these are growing in popularity. There's now 34 cities and water providers across Colorado that have turf replacement incentives. They operate differently. Sometimes they cut you a rebate check. Sometimes they give you a garden in a box, a plant, of native water-wise plants. These can be residential and commercial. There's about 10 water providers in cities, I believe. Northern Water also has a program, but that are in northern Colorado that have these programs. So look it up depending on where you're based. And these have this, really significant opportunity at scale to save water. We estimate 1 to 2 acre foot per acre per year. And the state has recognized this opportunity, and they're now investing in local turf replacement programs. That funding that was allocated through HB 221151 is now almost all used up. So WRA will be working to help identify additional state resources for that in coming years. And I know my time is up, so I'm going to just thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Lindsay. Yes. We do have about 3 minutes, so any questions for Lindsay? There you go.
I'm curious. You mentioned watering your lawn is consumptive, and it kind of goes to something that was said earlier. And I'm curious to know what percentage of municipal water use is consumptive versus agricultural use being consumptive.
Excellent question. I mean, the short answer is that most indoor water use you can reuse, right? It's going to go to a centralized wastewater treatment plant. It's going to get reused either for, non-potable irrigation purposes, or it will go back into the South Platte or a water supply and it will get reused downstream. And then most, I want to say does anyone know this? It's about 85 or 90% non-consumptive for outdoor irrigation. But maybe my other panelists have more nuance to add. Okay.
And your pie graphs went, maybe I'm not clear, but on that 11 million, then it went down to 3.7 for consumption, and the brown piece of the pie, which is municipality, increased.
Yeah, well, that was
So-
as a percentage basis.
Yeah, I didn't know that would mean that there's more consumption in the municipal.
Well, there's a huge part of municipal consumption, which is, I'm sorry. There's a huge part of municipal water that's called, those of you familiar with the term, it's billed and unbilled water. And so in Colorado, let me do the math on this. It's something like an average 16% of the water that is actually extracted and treated in a water treatment system never makes it to a meter in a house. And so that all infiltrates and it goes back to groundwater and eventually goes back to the system. So that's all non-consumptive. But it's kind of an interesting issue that most places have, is that you actually have a lot of water treated, never makes it to a household, and that just returns to the system. It's actually very clean water. That's the good news about it.
Good question.
I think we can probably do one more question.
This question might apply for previous speakers too. I'm curious why the city of Fort Collins, I understand the panel probably has a design purpose, but most of the folks here live in municipality like Fort Collins. We don't have a panel member here. They're the ones impacting our fees. They're the ones implementing the turf reduction programs, all of that. I'm just curious why they aren't present, and if particularly in the turf and so forth, if there's a push there, how the things that go through maybe the county, what the county is doing, impact the city, or do they just operate independent of all this?
Yes, so that's a good question. Our next session, which is on water conservation and sharing, we do have a Fort Collins utility person speaking on that panel. They'll be speaking specifically about all of the different programs that they have and are implementing and some of the water savings that they've been doing. This one was more kind of the overview of the supply and the risks, but we're going to get into those specifics in the next session.
I'll just give some kudos to Fort Collins, who does have a very robust, successful turf replacement program for both commercial and residential, and a new gray water reuse ordinance. So some exciting opportunities.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. I appreciate it. All right, as Karen is very efficiently pulling up the next presentation, I am excited to reintroduce to you all Brad Udell from the Colorado Water Center.
So, good evening, all commissioners. Michelle, Karen, thanks for putting this all together. So, my topic tonight is Colorado River water supply, climate change, and aridification. And you'll note I don't use drought, although I'll often let it slip in to my vernacular, because what we're undergoing right now is not really drought. Drought is temporary. This is something different. And the term that a lot of scientists have gravitated to is aridification. This image here is actually at Lake Powell, the nation's second largest reservoir. I took it this spring That's a boat ramp there in the distance that's completely out of commission because the reservoir got to about 25% full. It rebounded somewhat this year, and I'll show you how much it rebounded. That boat ramp's actually back in operation. So John thankfully showed an image like this earlier, right? Colorado River scaled to size. And the Colorado River is enormous. It's about 80% of the surface water in Colorado. It's far bigger than all other rivers. And frankly, on the Front Range, if we had to live on the South Platte and the Arkansas, we'd have a very different water system because half of the water that we use on the Front Range comes out of the Colorado River system. And there are, John mentioned the 44 transbasin diversions. This image shows many of them. Most of them are actually pretty tiny, these transbasin diversions, but a couple of them are not. Colorado Big Thompson and Denver Water have two huge ones, as does Aurora and Colorado Springs. And again, without those diversions on the Front Range using Colorado River water, it would be completely different here. So this is an image of the basin, and all those big red arrows represent major diversions out of or upstream in the basin. And there are 7 different states in this basin, 2 nations and 30 tribes. The annual flow going back to 1906, about 14 and 7.75 million acre feet. It's about the size of the Hudson River. It's actually not a very big river. Some call it the hardest working river. The worst drought in the gauged record started in the year 2000, and that drought, the annual total's about 12.5 million acre feet. That's about a 20% decline relative to the flow in the 20th century. And importantly, multiple scientific papers now have put up to half of that decline on human-caused climate change. Why? Because of increased evaporation and potentially also because of reductions in precipitation. That precipitation question is far harder to answer with short-term periods of record. 40 million people depend on this system. Every major city in the American Southwest. So Las Vegas, 90% dependent. Phoenix, 50%. I grew up in Tucson. Arguably, Tucson is 100% dependent because there's no surface water supply in Tucson. Again, the Front Range of Colorado, about half dependent. Albuquerque and Santa Fe actually get water out of the Colorado River despite being in the Rio Grande. Cheyenne, believe it or not, through a complicated mechanism, effectively gets Colorado River water. It's just hard to overstate how important it is to every major city in the American Southwest. There's 4.5 million irrigated acres, and some of the really important agriculture in the U.S. is right on the U.S.-Mexico border in Yuma and in a place called the Imperial Irrigation District in California. And those places have 365-day growing seasons. They grow much of your winter produce. It was fully allocated way back in 1922, and there's this big, broad body of laws and treaties and Supreme Court decisions that we call the Law of the River that encompasses every legal agreement. And I'll talk about the compact here in just a little bit. Withdrawals equaled supplies in about the year 2000. This year, actually last year in June of 2022, the federal government announced because the 2 largest reservoirs in the United States, Lakes Mead and Powell, were so low that we needed immediate cuts of something like 2 to 4 million acre feet in use between 2023 and 2026 when new rules are going to be negotiated. And so we now have 2 different environmental impact statement processes underway in the basin. A special EIS and SEIS that's underway that'll just determine the rules for the next 3 years, and then a longer term set of rules that will take place govern operation post 2026. This year, finally in May of 2023, we ended up with an agreement for the next 3 years amongst the 7 states after some amazing posturing and sort of elbowing. And the 2026 rules are underway as well. And the one thing I want to point out on this image is in the middle of it is the dividing line between the upper and lower basins, because back in 1922 it got split into two parts, and I'll talk about that in a couple of slides. So the combined volume of Lakes Mead and Powell are shown on this image from 1935 all the way out to March 2024. So the March 2024 are projections. They're the little dots on the far right side there. You'll see the initial fill of Lake Powell, and then it flattens out until about the 1970s. That's when Lake Powell came online, and Powell then takes roughly 20 years to fill. And in January of 2000, these two reservoirs were 95% full. Almost 50 million acre feet were in those two reservoirs. But by April 2023, they were about 25% full. So we'd lost 70% of the contents of, again, the nation's two largest reservoirs. And you can see the two red arrows there. And that's a loss of 34 million acre feet, or about 1.5 million acre feet every year right there. Again, I mentioned earlier, these flows are down 20% compared to the 20th century. And our wet 2023, right? Everybody in the room kind of knows we had this great winter and everybody got excited about it. Well, let me show you what it did to the combined volume of both reservoirs. On the right side, you can see measured in percent there. It did that. So for all the hoopla, that gets a big whoop-de-doo-dah, right? That's about a 10% increase. And many reporters have asked me, well, how long would it take to refill this system? Well, the kind of dumb answer is, well, if you had a bunch of years like this back to back, which you never have, it would take 6. But the better answer is to go back and look at how long it took Lake Mead or Lake Powell to fill, starting in the 1970s, that ramp. It took 20 some odd years to fill during that period, in a wetter period with lower demands. So I have been saying for years that climate change is water change. And this is an image from the space shuttle. It's to the Pacific Ocean. This is the water planet, right? 70% of the Earth's surface is water. I love this image because you can see a cumulonimbus cloud there in the sort of left center, representing water vapor, right? And the water cycle is a heat-driven cycle, right? Driven by solar energy. Vast quantities of water evaporate every day from the oceans. Most of that rains back down on the ocean, but a little bit of it makes it over onto the surface of the land. And in addition to moving water around, the water cycle actually moves heat, because when you evaporate water, the embedded energy in that water, in that evaporated water, it's still there. And when a water precipitates out, that heat gets released. That's the heat that drives thunderstorms and hurricanes. So the movement of heat around the planet and the movement of water are joined at the hip. And in an era of climate change, this is really important, because as you warm the atmosphere actually holds more moisture. 5% or 5 Fahrenheit warming is about 20% increase. And one way that I try and convey that climate change is water change is we now have a bigger sponge above our head. And that sponge allows the atmosphere to hold more water. And then when it decides to come out, it comes out in buckets, right? It seems like hardly a day goes by where you don't have a picture of some unbelievable flood around the surface of the earth. And those new floods, they're being driven by this warmer world that we now inhabit. So heating up the earth and unevenly heating it, right? The Arctic's heating about 3 times as fast as elsewhere. It leads to a whole bunch of water cycle changes. More evaporation, more precipitation, more moisture in general. This leads to changes in weather patterns. Often it's said that the wet areas get wetter and drier. We now get more intense floods and droughts. And in our snowmelt system here, we also see some other unusual changes, right? We see more rain now and less snow. So winters here, we'll get rain in December. When I grew up, that never happened, rain in December. We get earlier runoff, between 2 and 6 weeks earlier now in the Colorado River Basin. We have higher water temperatures and more intense rain. And that earlier runoff sets us up a little bit for failure later in the year because plants green up sooner, they can use more water sooner, and it leaves less to run off into our rivers and creeks. Hence, one really easy explanation for that 20% decline in flow. So what about the compact and the basics of it? This is the signing in Santa Fe in 1922. Basin divided into an upper and lower basin. Each basin got 7.5 million acre feet of what's called beneficial consumptive use. The lower basin, in particular Arizona, complained, and so the lower basin got an extra 1 million acre feet. The Mexico Treaty, which was anticipated but not in place at the time, the compact said water would first be supplied from surplus, if there were any, and then equally from the lower basin and upper basin. And then finally, this clause, which is so important. Compact Article 3D says the upper basin will not cause the flow to be depleted below 75 million acre feet every 10 running years. This is the compact call provision that Linda talked about earlier, and it's a really important provision. Again, note that language. Upper basin will not cause the flow to be depleted. The tribes were completely excluded from the compact. And I'll note every one of these provisions has an ongoing dispute about how to interpret it. And the law of the river is far broader than just the compact, but the compact's really important. Here's a look at water use from 1960 by basin. So evaporation there is down at the bottom, about 1 million an acre feet, 10% roughly. Here's the upper basin. Upper basin uses only 4.5 million acre feet out of their 7.5 promised, and it hasn't changed since about 1980. The lower basin use peaked in 2000 at 10.5, far more than their compact allocation, and it's now about 8.5 right there. And then the total basin use with Mexico peaked at 17 and now is about 14.3. Again, note I said the flows since 2000 about 12.5 million acre feet. That's a mismatch, and that can't continue. That's why those reservoirs have plummeted downward. Agriculture uses about 80%. And this is true worldwide, actually, in dry areas. It's not anything special about us. It's just when you grow crops, you use a lot of water. So what about a compact call? Here's the conventional old take. 10 years ago, I would have given you this story. I would have said a compact call is analogous to a river call in a state where a downstream senior calls up the state engineer as representative and says, hey, I'm not getting my water, go check it out. And the division engineer can go out and actually shut down diverters so that that senior gets the water to which their water right under prior appropriation entitles them. A compact calls an imperfect analogy because there's no enforcement mechanism. The federal government can't come and shut us down. There's nobody to do that, but the idea still has taken hold. Again, there's this upper basin obligation. And many attorneys, in the absence of a pre-climate change world, said this was a hard and fast delivery obligation that the upper basin had to make. 75 million acre feet every 10 running years, or 82.3 if you count the Mexico. So this is what I would have told you. And what's really important is that transbasin diverters, namely the cities in the Front Range, would be enormously impacted by this because they are junior users in Colorado. And I will again say, look back to the language I said. There's not an affirmative obligation in there. It's a will not deplete, right? And for years now, the state engineer, the attorney general, others have studied how a compact call might affect us. So here's the new interpretation. That 3D, it's phrased as a negative obligation, not a positive obligation. Will not cause the flow to be depleted versus will deliver. It was an anti-hoarding, a drought obligation. It's not appropriate for the climate change world. Drought is a temporary flow reduction, not around a long-term mean that doesn't vary. Under climate change, it's a permanent flow reduction around a declining mean. The Upper Basin would have never agreed to a flow obligation, a fixed delivery obligation under permanent declining flows, and the language says they didn't do that. Equal sharing is embedded in the compact, and the problem right now is the lower basin's gotten dependent on this extra water, a fixed delivery amount. But there's a dawning lower basin awareness that they're going to have to share in this. And we need a new interpretation of what 3D means, but it's not clear exactly what that is. And a simple possibility is until the river flows decline to twice what the upper basin uses, which is to say 9 million acre feet, the upper basin shouldn't have to deliver any water to the lower basin. So we're going to continue to live with this uncertainty for a little bit of time. But I just want to point out that there's this dawning awareness that that delivery obligation is not what it was once thought to be. So aridification, not drought. Listen, it's called climate change for a reason. The climate is continuing to change. I really object to the term new normal here because it's likely these flows continue to decline, possibly as much as 40% by mid-century. Aridification involves declining snowpacks, earlier runoff, shorter winters, more rain, less snow, higher temperatures, drying soils, severe fires, forest mortality. Sorry if I'm depressing you. This warm, thirsty atmosphere that holds more moisture, storm tracks that probably move poleward, in our case northward, and mega drought. So let me summarize. Our demands in the system are out of balance with the supplies. These reservoirs are unsustainably low, flows are down. Reservoirs can't continue to release water to fix this imbalance. Much of the problem's in the lower basin, but we're not scot-free here. We're going to have to do our part to help solve this problem. Any growth in upper basin demands is also problematic. And there are people in the upper basin who'd like to see demands grow, but there's just so much water, right? I mean, mass balance rules here. And any additional upper basin demands mean the lower basin has to curtail not just a little bit, but even more, which is even harder than their big lift right now. And additional upper basin demands put existing upper basin demands at risk. So it's not a free lunch to think that, oh, we're entitled to more water, let's go get it. Potential for additional large climate change flow reductions, another 20% by mid-century. And this upper basin obligation is just not clear. We need a new understanding. There are these two processes underway to figure out what the new rules are in the system. And finally, let me just finish by saying that prior appropriation, the system by which all Western states live under, is a winner-take-all system. And in a modern interdependent society, it's really problematic. Because oftentimes municipal users are junior users and they can't be shut off completely. You just can't do that. And so much of the issues in the American West around water right now are trying to figure out how to make winner take all less harsh. How do you share supplies under a system that doesn't really promote sharing to begin with?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matt. I think we probably have time for one question. And you're the lucky guy who caught my eye when... Sorry. Oh, that's harsh. I'm sorry.
So I guess in the West, each state has kind of their own individual water law. And my understanding is that Colorado is the strictest in terms of prior appropriation compared to the other states, in that we're most strict. We don't have consideration of other uses, that sort of thing. If there were to be federal involvement, if I guess we weren't able to come up with a 7-state agreement on a Colorado River Compact, how would the differences between those state water laws kind of play out at the federal level?
So in the case of the Colorado, there's an Upper Colorado River Compact that was signed in 1948. And in theory, that describes the relationship amongst the 4 states that sit in the upper basin. The federal government actually has vast powers in the lower basin because of a Supreme Court case in 1964 and because of some federal legislation down there. It's not exactly clear how this plays out, but I think the lesson from this huge court case in 1964 was you can't solve this by litigation. You have got to negotiate these solutions. It's far too complicated for a court system to get this right. And I'm actually optimistic about the ability of these 7 states and Mexico and the federal government all to come to an agreement. Now, listen, you're going to see a lot of sharp elbows out there and a lot of drama, but ultimately at the end of the day, people will come up with a solution to figure out how to deal with these declining flows. I'm not optimistic about a lot of things, but that ultimately I am, and it's good. Actually, just another little uplifting after all my bummer about climate change. Governments allocate resources, right? And you might not think of water allocation and water management as U.S. government, but it truly is. And there's some real bright spots here in the way these states work together. Again, despite all the posturing and stuff in the news, we will get this fixed, I think, and figured out in a way. And one more just comment about Colorado. This state has more good going for it than any other state in the basin. And it's because of that court system. We actually have dedicated attorneys and engineers and a whole system of water professionals that a lot of other states don't have. It's cumbersome at times because of this court system, but it actually gives us information and data that a lot of other states don't have. And we use that to our benefit.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brad. I appreciate it. And for our final presenter before we open it up for questions, and we'll go to you first when we open up for questions, we have Esther Vincent here. She is from Northern Water, and I will go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. I think our bios were a little off. I think you just met Mr. Gloom and I'm Miss Doom, so I'm sorry about that. I'm going to talk about fires, flood risk, and water quality. I have lots of slides, but lots of pictures. Words don't really do justice when you're telling the story, so I'm going to take you on a little bit of a ride here, but hopefully not too long. Just a couple words here about Northern Water. We are a conservancy district, a quasi-governmental agency. You've heard about the Colorado Big Thompson project a couple times in the prior presentations. We cooperate and manage the Colorado Big Thompson project alongside the Bureau of Reclamation. And we also manage other large infrastructure and are in the business of future water development projects, which some of them you're probably familiar with, including Glade Reservoir and the Northern Integrated Supply Project, as well as the Windy Gap Farming Project and Chimney Hollow Reservoir, which is currently under construction just outside of Loveland, west of Carter Lake. We serve a population that is now over 1 million people. We are a raw water provider, so that was a term that was used earlier. So what that means is that we don't treat the water, we manage a collection system that stores the water and then distributes it to the end users, being municipalities that now own about 70% of our shares, the shares in our system, and then about 29-30% that is still in the hands of agriculture. So we get that water to these users. The municipal users treat that water and then eventually bring it to their end customers. If you live in this area in Larimer County, a very significant portion of the water that comes out at the tap comes from the Colorado River and the Colorado Big Thompson project. And we deliver on average about 210,000 acre feet. And we talked about what an acre foot is. I have a picture of it, which is pretty much the same analogy that Dr. Tracy used, a football field with an acre with a foot of water on it. And this is a map of the geographic area that Northern Water serves. The area that we serve goes all the way north from Fort Collins down to Brookfield, out to Greeley, and then kind of narrows down along the South Platte all the way out to the Nebraska state line. And on the west side of the Continental Divide is the collection system where we receive and capture water from the headwaters of the Colorado River and then transport it through this significant Trans-Mountain diversion, which carries water through the Adams Tunnel, which is 13 miles long. It picks up the water from Grand Lake on the west side of the Rocky Mountain National Park and through this 13-mile long, 9-foot diameter tunnel, brings it over to the east slope where it daylights near Estes Park and then makes its way down a series of pipelines and tunnels and hydropower plants before it ends up in Horsetooth Reservoir, just in our backyard here, in Carter Lake, and then eventually down in Boulder Reservoir as well. A little bit of context, and I'm picking up a theme from Brad here. Climate change and compromised forest health. Can't talk about fires without talking about this. We are living in a warming climate. I'm not telling you anything new you don't know already. This is a graph of the Colorado average temperature with a very clear increasing trend. What comes with this as the temperature increases is, and Brad's talked about this, earlier springs, hotter summers, longer growing season, generally a net water budget deficit for our systems, earlier snowmelt and runoff, more frequent and severe heat waves, greater evapotranspiration, and a longer fire season. So much longer than the last two major fires that we had in 2020 occurred well into October and even early November. And you couple that with extensive mountain pine beetle kill, and you've got a recipe for really, frankly, for some disasters. So if you look at the statistics of wildfire extent in the United States since 1983, that's the recorded history that we have. You can see an increase in not only just the number of fires, but the acres burned every year. In millions of acres, and this is a very drastically increasing trend over a short period of time. And if you look more closely at Colorado, we have the four largest fires in Colorado recorded history that occurred all in 2020, with the two big ones, Cameron Peak Fire and East Troublesome. Mullen Fire was partially in Colorado, partially in Wyoming, but equally a large fire. So let's talk a little bit about these fires in relation to our water systems. This is kind of a rough overlay of the East Troublesome Fire and the Cameron Peak fires on top of that Northern Water Map, which is our major water supply from the Colorado Big Thompson project. And so the takeaway here is that these two fires affected directly the systems on both sides of the divide. So if you're the city of Fort Collins, say, and your water supply is the Poudre River as well as the Colorado Big Thompson project, it was double whammy, because your West Slope Colorado River water supply was affected by the East Troublesome Fire, and then your direct diversions off of the Poudre River were affected by the Cameron Peak Fire. Same story for the city of Greeley. I think in the first year of the fire, they lost about 40 days of diversions off of the Poudre River due to poor water quality running off of the Cameron Peak scar, and the water quality being so poor that they could not treat it, and they had to let the water pass by. So you're losing that volume of water, and it's adding to the stress of the water supply that is already pressured, from climate change and decline in supplies in general. And this is what the East Troublesome Fire looked like, I think, a couple of days after the fire. This is in the Comanche Valley, just as you're coming off of Trail Ridge down from the Continental Divide towards Grand Lake, and that's what it looked like. And then here's another couple of aerial pictures of the East Troublesome Fire. Also, on the right side, you can see from left to right, this is Grand Lake and then Shadow Mountain Reservoir. And then in the distance, you can see Granby Reservoir. So it kind of gives you a sense of the extent of the devastation of these fires. And that happened just upstream of the receiving water bodies that we depend on for water supply. I'm going to give you a lot of illustrations and maps from the East Troublesome Fire because that's what I've worked on more directly. But pretty much everything I'm saying about the East Troublesome Fire, you can translate that to the Cameron Peak Fire. They're very similar stories to tell there. So for the East Troublesome Fire, we had about 193,000 acres of burn. About 10% was on private lands. The rest of it, the 90%, was on federal land, primarily forest service land. And what you see here is a map of the burn severity with the different colors showing how severely burned the watershed was. And you can see that the spatial extent of this burn that covered 37 miles, and it jumped over the fire traveled 20 miles the night of October 22nd, burning over 100,000 acres in that one night. Much of that growth happened over a 90-minute period during which the fire made a 17-mile run, pushed by hurricane-forced wind, and to such extent that the fire jumped over the Continental Divide that night and actually burned in the headwaters of the Big Thompson River in the Moraine Park. 589 structures were burned and 4,000 residents were evacuated that night. And it's a miracle that really we only lost a couple of people in that situation, and we lost them because they refused to leave, not because they couldn't leave. So water quality impacts. So when you have a severe burn on the landscape, it really changes the way the hydrology processes work, because in some places of the watershed, if there's severe burn, it changes the characteristics of the soil. The soil essentially melts and it creates almost this like plastic layer on top of the soil, and the water no longer infiltrates into the ground. You have no more trees and vegetation that intercept the water, and so it all flows downhill with a lot of force and concentration of the volumes of water. So with that comes erosion and transport of material, including ash, but then eventually it's sediment, it's debris, and it doesn't take a big precipitation event to set the wheels in motion. And once that cycle starts, it tends to feed on itself over time, and the erosion kind of speeds up over time in certain areas. And it carries more nutrients and more compounds that get dissolved in the water, or not dissolved, or can be just suspended in the water, and all that makes it into downstream water bodies and streams and impoundments. And because of that, you have significant changes both in quantity of water that comes down from the burn scar, as well as the quality of water that comes from these burn scars. So let's talk a little bit about the wildfire aftermath. The picture you're looking at here is Highway 125 in the Willow Creek Basin, and pretty much every time it rains, this is what happens. The hillside comes down, and they have to shut down the highway and remove the debris. So the kinds of impacts that you see in the wake of a fire includes debris flows, flooding, water treatment intakes shut off, loss of storage capacity. So you have all this material that's moving into reservoirs and it deposits and then it sits there. So you're losing your storage volume. Because there are significant inputs of nutrients that come with post-fire runoff, and that comes into receiving water bodies like lakes and reservoirs, that causes it fuels algal growth. And not the right kind of algae, typically blue-green algae, which has the propensity to release cyanotoxins that are water treatment problems and that are toxic to humans and wildlife, and if you come into contact with this water. Property loss, obviously, not just from the fire directly, but from these post-fire events and floods, and then frequent road closures are all very typical. Loss of life is top of mind when you're talking about post-fire impacts. Sadly, we made that experience with the Black Hollow flood in the Cameron in 2021 from the Cameron Peak fire burn scar, and you can see how it made the headlines at the time, and a number of people died during that flood, and there was tremendous devastation of property as well during the event. These are additional pictures on the East Troublesome fire in the Drowsy Creek watershed, just a little bit down in the Granby area. And same thing, they had a very devastating flooding event in August of 2022. This is a picture I actually took recently of the Stillwater Creek road crossing. This is upstream of Granby Reservoir. And last year, this road was still there. This happened during snow melt this year. We had a rain on snow event in June, and the road's gone. And we're going to continue to see more of that. If you drive around the watershed, you can see lots of places where these drainages are about to take away infrastructure and roads in particular. Another example of Highway 125 in Greene County. And then there's degraded water quality during spring runoff, but also during storm events. These are data that show the turbidity in Willow Creek Reservoir. It's one of our water features on the west slope, and typically when you get to 100 NTUs, which is the red line on the graph, water treatment plants can't treat that water. You can see here the data goes way beyond that. We have readings of 1,000 NTUs on a regular basis. This was data from 2022. This is a Blackwater event on the North Inlet that flows into Grant Lake directly. This was after a storm event in August of 2021. These are samples we collected just the day after. They were, just straight black, and you can sit them on the shelf for months, and they'll just stay black. It doesn't settle. It doesn't, go away. The Grand Lake Beach, that same day, August 4th, from that Blackwater event. Grand Lake is a tourism-driven economy, so when these kinds of things happen, this is very impactful to them. Willow Creek Reservoir has experienced these harmful algae blooms now repeatedly since the fire, and we have had the presence of cyanotoxins detected in the reservoir. It had to be closed to recreation in 2022. This is an aerial picture of that algae bloom in Willow Creek. And then we have debris that comes into the system. This is a debris boom. We have installed several debris booms at key points in our infrastructure to protect that infrastructure from these debris that come in and accumulate them in places where we can go in and remove them and take it out of the reservoir. This is the inlet to Willow Creek Reservoir, and you can see this all these shallow areas. These are new shallow areas that are the result of all the sediments that have been coming in from Willow Creek into the reservoir. So we're losing storage in this particular water body. We've lost about 1% of the active storage annually. We don't know how much longer this is going to continue, whether that trend is going to increase, and whether eventually it's going to be a problem. But Denver Water can tell you stories about how they've had to dredge their own reservoirs at incredible cost to retain or restore their capacity, only to see it lost within 1 or 2 rain events after that. So restoration and protection is really important in the wake of these events. We've done a lot of that collaboratively with a lot of partners, and it's included some post-fire flood protection, so helping the communities set up flood protection walls with like sandbags, but also working on the streams themselves, hardening the streams in places where there was a lot of erosion to protect infrastructure. Protect with debris booms. I've talked about that, places where it's really important. And then we've done a lot of mulching of the watershed. We've covered, a lot, it's all relative, 12,000 acres. When you compare that to the 193,000 acres that burned, it seems like a lot of acres, but it's not. It's a small portion of the watershed that we've treated. But we've done 2 years of that. It cost $26 million to do this work. It's primarily on private lands, but also on federal lands, on Forest Service lands. And the idea there is to try to reduce the impact of these water drops when they fall on the bare soil, and to put a cover on it so that we minimize the amount of erosion that happens and allow the soils to stabilize, and hopefully vegetation to be able to take hold and regrow and then stabilize the hill slope. This is a mulching event. We did 19,000 drops like this one that you just saw on the movie. So what does that mean for the future? The strategies that we need to employ to be prepared, because we're going to continue. We can do all kinds of forest health, proactive forest health work, and that's good. That needs to be part of the strategy. But we're never going to treat the entire watersheds in the forest that are upstream of our water supply systems. And so we're going to have fires, even if we get really good at forest health management. We're going to have fires nonetheless. And so we need to be prepared to respond better to these events when they happen. And that comes with the development of social infrastructure, relationship building between agencies, but also within the communities so that they know what to do in the wake of these events. a lot of funding and capacity for agencies. It takes millions and millions of dollars to do this kind of work, and preparing for scarcity, because that means also at times you're not going to be able to use the water that is coming by in the river. You have to let it go by. So you have to also think about the water, the demand side management that Lindsay was talking about a little bit. We need to think about water supply, storage, and portfolio diversification. Go back to the story of Fort Collins, where both of their water supply sources were affected by fires the same year. And we need to get really good at this post-fire restoration work. And we have collectively assembled our lessons learned in a report that we have distributed largely to federal and state legislators and to agencies so that they can change their policies, so that we can adjust our processes to be more efficient and effective and get the response on the ground quickly when it's needed, because you can't do this work 5 years after the fires. You have to get there really quickly right after it's happened. So time is of the essence. And that's all I have, and I will take any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Esther. I'm going to look to the audience for maybe one question for Esther before we go back to the full panel. So question for Esther, please go ahead.
I'm just curious, why is mulching not just fuel for the next fire, or is it a question of the lesser of two evils of soil erosion?
So that's a good question. I mean, the mulching eventually it kind of degrades. If you've ever put mulch on your yard, you'll see, usually you have to kind of reapply it, every couple of years, sometimes every year. It breaks down over time. So it's not really a fuel source, and especially in the quantities that we're putting on the ground relative to the dead wood that's already there from the forest.
Thank you. Good question. But now I'm going to go questions for the whole panel. So Esther, if you want to sit down. For my panelists, make sure you turn your mic on before you talk. Don't leave it on. But if you're going to talk, turn it on. I do want, in the spirit of tonight and our theme for tonight, which is water supply and risks, I do want to bring your attention to, we have 3 more sessions in this water education series. So in our limited time tonight, I'm hoping we can keep our questions relevant to our speakers and their expertise that we have here tonight. We have about 10 minutes, so I know that's not a ton of time, but we're going to get going. So go ahead.
We've heard a lot of information about the Colorado River and a 20-year trend of decreasing flows. We heard about the Front Range being heavily dependent on the Colorado River. And then there was a slide earlier about a 50% expected growth in population in the Front Range. How do you reconcile all that? And do you ever see, it's an easy conclusion to make that there isn't enough water to support the Front Range 30 years from now, 40 years from now. Do you see water being imported to the region, Great Lakes, Canada, I don't know from where, but do you ever see that happening? Because from what you presented, you can conclude that there just isn't enough water in the future to support what's happening on the Front Range.
So this is a question. I've been doing this water research administrative job for several decades. And first year I was doing it, I got the question every year ever. First of all, the complications with importing water from, pick your area, Great Lakes, Mississippi. You think about the Colorado River Compact. You cannot move raw water across state boundaries without both state legislatures agreeing to it and the U.S. Congress. So you think about the technical elements of it. That's trivial compared to the political elements. So from a political perspective, never going to happen, because you'd have to have the second water crossed from one state to another. That state's engineer would say, that's our water. Because again, all water in the United States is owned by the states. And raw water crossing a state boundary doesn't matter if you think you put the infrastructure in or not. It is that state's water for that state to decide what to do with. So from a political perspective, that's a non-starter. The other side of it is, most people don't think about cities that have already done what you've suggested. For example, the city of Seattle, rainy, right? Pacific Northwest. They over doubled their population without increasing a single acre foot of delivered water. They did it all through conservation, land use planning. What drove them there had more to do with the cost of water infrastructure in a heavily urbanized area, and they didn't want to pay that cost. But you start looking at cities such as Seattle, such as what Portland has done, such as what Reno has done. They've doubled their population and not increased the amount of water they need. There needs to be really a mindset change, which was touched on by several here, that what our expectations are of water in the West to meet this growing population. And the fact that the subject of non-functional turf was brought up. We tend not to think of the value of water when we use it. When you stop and think about it, not from conservation terms, not from water efficiency terms, but from, oh, I'm turning on the water. What value am I getting for this? Well, you're watering the street. Probably not getting much value from that. You look at, a lovely landscape of grass and realize native vegetation may look better, use a whole lot less water. That's what's going to happen. And so, there's this mindset that we use so much water per person right now, and that's what we need in the future. The fact is, the vast majority of water we're using individually in our homes or in our communities provides us zero value whatsoever. And we just have to come to terms with, we're not going to use water that doesn't provide us value anymore. The agricultural interests have figured this out. They have gotten to the point where they don't use water unless they're getting money out of it. They're actually pretty good about it. But this is one in terms of the growing population. As the population migrates in from other places in the country that may have lots of water or may have little water, there's going to have to be a culture change when they come in, that you live in a semi-arid region, you adjust your behavior and your value system to reflect that, and increasing population 50% will be no big deal. There's lots of places that have done it. So this is really a culture shift that has to happen more than it is any kind of technological problem that has to be solved.
I just want to briefly add on the demand management side. We know that conservation efficiency right now in Colorado, almost across the board for any community, is the fastest, most reliable way to meet that supply and demand gap. And, I think there's a tendency for us to think we already did some of that already. We have these programs in place, we're working on our codes, but we have not in Colorado in any way reached diminishing returns when it comes to the amount of conservation and the trends that we can still see over time in per capita and overall demand. It's not saying that every single community in Colorado, there's some really fast growing communities in Larimer County. They have really junior rights. Not every single community is going to see overall demand reduction, but there's huge opportunities and there's a lot of really successful case studies for us to work from.
I would add one more point too, and I agree with everything that was said, is that we're not the only area that's growing in Colorado, and there are parts, of Colorado south of us that are growing as well, and they've got their eyes on the water supplies in this part of the area. So we have to do all of these demand side management strategies. They're critically important. They're going to be part of our future here, but we also need to protect the supplies and the resources that we currently have within this area, within Larimer County and within the Northern Colorado region. We need to make sure these supplies stay here.
Thank you, guys.
One question, it looks like obviously the bulk of the water is still used for agricultural uses, but a big reduction of 50% over time. How much of that agricultural use is for livestock? Is there a number on that? And does that play significantly into the equation?
So in the Colorado River, upwards of 40% of water is used for forage crops. It's a stunningly high number. And there are climate implications here as well, right? Beef cattle having particularly high greenhouse gas emissions associated with them. There's going to be, there's an ongoing discussion right now about sort of ag's water use, and it's a really uncomfortable discussion, right? Because ag serves all of us a very useful purpose. Eating is good. But again, when you utilize 80% of the water, you're going to be 80% of the solution, at least as a starting point going in on any kind of discussion about how you solve these issues. So you're right, ag, forage crops, big deal.
Yeah, and on the east slope, when you look at the South Platte Republican Basin in particular, it's well over 50% of the crop production. We see the crop production here, and closer to the Front Range, there's more diversity in the crops grown. But when you start going out, to the east, it's dominated by alfalfa, corn silage, so forth and so on. And there is this concern that if that land comes out of production, the Colorado dairy and beef industry go under. The reality is we've seen this happen in many, many, many other areas, and it's just like importation of those feeds to sustain Colorado dairy and cattle operations from the Midwest is no big deal. When you look at the amount of alfalfa exported from this country on an annual basis, I mean, there are 50,000 acres in northern Washington where the guy growing the alfalfa has an entire vertically integrated company set up, and it all ships to China, Japan, and South Korea. That's just one small piece. So when I look at what the impacts are going to be, yes, alfalfa and forage crops are going to be the ones to go when the cities come in and buy the water. But what it means is there's going to be a shift of where the cattle and dairy industry get their feedstocks from, and they'll just be putting it on trains and moving it from the Midwest. And it's not going to be as dramatic as people like to make it out to be. And again, you can see this having happened for decades across all of these areas that have become water short, and water moves out of ag and into municipalities. And then the other elements of ag shift around that.
And I would just make a plug again for our next session, which will have 2 representatives of the agricultural community coming and speaking about conservation and efficiency in agriculture.
Good plug.
This St. George wants to build a pipeline from the Colorado River. Under what how did they do this? Because Utah is not using its full amount and reality hadn't set in, or what?
So, yeah, there's something called the Lake Powell Pipeline, which would take water out of Lake Powell and ship it across northern Arizona into the St. George area. Their per capita use is around 300 gallons per person per day. And there are a lot of people looking at that going, maybe you should think about trying to get your gallons per capita per person down before you start looking at utilizing a source like the Colorado River. We'll see how this plays out. It's a really complicated topic, that pipeline in particular.
And just to put that 300 gallons in context, if you look at the total water extracted in Colorado for utilities, it's 163 gallons per capita per day. And if you just look at the water that actually makes it to the house, the build part, it isn't lost the system, it's under 125 gallons per capita per day. That's the average for Colorado. So 300 gallons per capita per day, it's like, I don't know what they're doing with the water, man.
Just if you're curious to learn more about that issue, WA put out a report called the Local Waters Alternative a couple years ago that basically assesses, given their reuse potential, demand reductions, like could they work within their existing resources, their Virgin River basin. It's pretty interesting. The TLDR is that, yes, they probably can with reduction opportunities.
So you were mentioning, a lot of good things that are going on around conservation, especially with municipal waters, and making sure that, giving people incentives and stuff to not be planting just, regular lawns and such. What I was curious about is you were showing a figure of about 14 million foot acres basically of water per year, and about 2 of that is diminishing because of evaporation. What thinking is going on around dealing with the evaporation issue, whether you're sending it through to supply the crop lines or whatever kind of thing?
Reservoir evaporation is particularly challenging to get to. You might have heard a few stories in the American West where a local utility will come in and dump a bunch of ping pong balls on top of somebody's reservoir. You can imagine that is not exactly an intervention that locals want to see. Frankly, reservoir river evap, I'm not sure we're ever going to do a lot about it. There's talk of sort of covering canals in Arizona with solar panels, for example. We'll see if that happens.
Is any of that thinking happening around here?
I'm not aware of any local ideas on this. Others might be.
So weirdly enough, the Colorado Water Center is starting a project where we're working with the Colorado Water Conservation Board, legislatively directed to look at photovoltaics, which looks at putting voltaics as both energy producers but also evaporation reduction predominantly on reservoirs. There's an excellent report by the National Renewable Energy Lab, I think published in like 2018, 2019, that really goes through the potential. And the thing is at some local levels on some specific situations it has potential, but when you start talking reservoirs the size of Meade and Powell, it's like, it's an absolute non-starter for so many different reasons. But it is out there, very local, specific circumstances where it may work. So it is being thought of, and Colorado legislature is thinking of it, but I don't see it as being large-scale implementation across all of Colorado.
Yeah, and the reservoir piece of it I get, but there's a lot of like the bottom ditch and all this stuff that's around these areas, and it seems like that would be the right places where you're overlaying photovoltaics or whatever. Try to balance the evaporation, increase electricity.
Yeah, the difficulty there and why that becomes, it's part of what we're supposed to be studying, but in the initial analysis, very few of our canals are concrete lined, how would I say, a high level of infrastructure investment. And the ditch managers and canal managers, they have to maintain these. They have to come through and dredge them. They have to do burning of the vegetation to the side. They got to repair. And if you put hardscape voltaics over there, they can't maintain them. And so that just becomes an operational issue that makes it very, very difficult. When you're talking something like some of the canals that are concrete lined, that's a very different subject. But very few canals in Colorado have that level of investment in terms of the canal infrastructure.
We're going to do one more question for this evening.
This question is really for Esther. Your chart earlier showed that ag represented 29%, I think, ownership of the water rights of CVT, but they take 40% of the deliveries. Does that mean they're leasing water from these municipalities?
Yes.
And does that mean they're kind of on borrowed time?
Yes, that's correct.
That was a very efficient last question. So I appreciate that, and I do appreciate all of you. Let's give our presenters, our panelists, a round of applause. Thank you all for being here on a Monday night. It's always great to see a room full of people that care about their community. So thank you. Thank you to the Colorado Water Center for helping Larimer County and the Board of County Commissioners put this and the series together. Again, don't forget to check out our next 3 series. If you didn't sign up with your email, go ahead and do that before you leave. That way we can send you more information to remind you about the series coming up and all that good information. And at the bottom, if you didn't notice at the bottom of your agenda, if you didn't pick up an agenda, do so, because at the bottom there's a link to the website. So you can find out all the information. With that, good evening and good night.